Thanks, everybody. It's an honor, a pleasure to be invited here and be amongst educators and share some of my thinking on the teaching of well-being, which is really, my PhD advisor was Ed Diener, who was a pioneer of well-being research. And he had always wanted this work to be impactful. And I think teaching well-being is one of those important ways that we can make this research impactful. So I hope that some of the ideas that can come from this discussion can find its way into other classrooms and benefit students and maybe teachers as well. But to start, because this whole conference is about well-being, what do we mean by well-being? The definition I have up here is just very general because it's supposed to capture all the different ways that we think about, talk about, and measure well-being. And basically, it's just any of the many ways that a person could experience and evaluate their life positively. Now, even though I'm talking about evaluating life positively or experiencing it positively, I'm not just talking about positive indicators. Of course, positive indicators are important. And when I say positive indicators, I'm talking about when people talk about how happy they feel, when they talk about wanting to experience joy, purpose, meaning in life, satisfaction, even how they feel about their own health. Those are positive indicators. Of course, those are relevant to our understanding of well-being. But negative indicators are also part of our understanding of well-being. So when people are concerned about their stress, anxiety or depression, that's also part of this concept of well-being. Obviously, we don't say that somebody who's very stressed has high levels of well-being, but we are concerned with reducing stress. We're concerned with reducing anxiety and depression. And when we do that, we say we improve that person's well-being. So well-being is about both the positive indicators as well as the negative indicators. And why is it important to talk about and teach well-being? This article just came out earlier this year. It's from a large international study, over 200,000 people. So they had lots of respondents across different age groups. And one of the findings was that young adults, people between the ages of 18 to 25, are significantly less happy than they used to be a couple of decades ago. Some researchers talk about a U-shaped happiness trend where people in midlife are supposed to be the least happy, and younger people are supposed to be fairly happy, and so it goes down and then it comes back up. But this recent survey suggests that actually younger people are not as happy as past data used to show. This was from a survey that college students in Singapore conducted. They asked university students here what their average levels of stress were on a scale from 1 to 10. On average, it was 7.6, which is fairly moderately high level of stress, not excessively high, but it's students are stressed, and some of the reasons for this include obviously academics, the amount of work, their study commitments that they have to do, but they're also concerned about their personal relationships, and they're concerned with things like self-confidence. Jean Twenge, she's a psychologist, and she was one of the first people to document a rise in unhappiness or discontent among adolescents. This is using data from the US. So what she observed was that from 2006 to 2016, there was a rise in unhappiness or discontent in adolescents, starting at around 2012. And she considered whether this could have to do with the economic factors. So she plotted unemployment rates in the US. And unemployment rates did rise, but actually a couple years before 2012. So the unemployment rates didn't seem to map onto this rise in unhappiness. What did seem to map onto this rise was the prevalence of smartphone adoption. So you don't have data Before 2010, I think in part because smartphones are relatively new, but the rise in smartphone adoption seems to coincide with this increase in unhappiness among adolescents. The amount of time that adolescents spend on the internet also seems to map onto this increase in unhappiness. So Twenge argued that this rise in unhappiness has to have something to do with the rise in digital media or social media. Okay. Other researchers have documented similar trends in other countries, and so that is becoming a key point of concern when we talk about the well-being of young adults, is what is the impact of digital media use on their well-being. There's a lot of research that still needs to be done to unpack what exactly, if it is digital media, what exactly is going on. But whether you believe it's a factor or not, and there are some researchers who feel that it's not necessarily digital media that's the problem. But one thing that you can't dispute is that social media is increasingly a large part of young people's lives, but also adults as well, right? We are relying on social media not just to connect with other people, but also to learn about things going on, to figure out what people think about current events. It is becoming a source of information. And when we think about young adults using social media to learn about different things, one of those things that they're going to learn about is happiness. There's going to be, they are going to see different representations of happiness on social media, and these representations sometimes offer mixed messages about what happiness involves, right? Some images convey this idea of happiness being individualistic. Other images might emphasize that happiness is more about your social life and having friends, and some images might portray the importance of non-materialistic aims, meaningful goals, helping out to clean up the environment, for example. And other images might convey the idea that happiness has more materialistic aspects about what you have and what you acquire. And all these representations don't necessarily complement each other, right? Sometimes they run against each other. And so we have to think about what young people are learning about well-being and what is important for well-being when they go on social media. When you go online, you also see all kinds and all matters of tips that people have for improving well-being and happiness. I don't know why the number 7 is popular, but that seems to be a good number that people like to land on when they come up with happiness tips. But it's a really important question. Like, when we're reading all of these tips, they're not citing any literature or any evidence, but they're just offering these tips. So how legitimate are these claims that we see online? And for students especially, it's important for them to be critical when they encounter this information. So it's because there's so much information about well-being and happiness online, and because there's such a risk of misinformation, that it becomes really important to talk about this concept of well-being literacy. And by well-being literacy, what we mean is the language, concepts, and knowledge that people use when they're talking about happiness, the happiness of themselves or the happiness of other people or their well-being. It's a language that we use to understand how people are feeling and why they're feeling the way they're feeling, why they may not be satisfied with their lives. And it's also the language that we use and the concepts that we use when we are trying to improve our well-being or improve the well-being of other people. So it's an important skill, actually. We think of it as a skill that can be taught and cultivated and developed. And why is it important? Is because the way we talk about happiness reflects our assumptions about what happiness is. So just look at some of these quotes about happiness. This one comes from Epicurus. He says, "Of all the means to ensure happiness, throughout the whole life, by far the most important is the acquisition of friends. Seems to make sense. But then Voltaire says, the happiest of all lives is a busy solitude. Ralph Waldo Emerson, for every minute you are angry, you lose 60 seconds of happiness. That seems to imply that happiness and unhappiness are always at odds with each other, right? Or that they're mutually exclusive in some way. Aeschylus says, happiness is a choice that requires effort at times. But Thich Nhat Hanh says a mindfulness practitioner is able to generate joy and happiness. It's not so hard. When you read through these quotes, I think we can all see there's a grain of truth in each of these quotes, right? But if there's a grain of truth in each of these quotes, even though they're somewhat contradictory, then it must be the case that these people might not be talking about the same thing. They're using the word happiness, but they may not all be talking about the same concept or experience. So, well-being literacy is a model developed by Lindsay Oates, and it consists of 5 components. The first component is vocabulary and knowledge. When we say knowledge, we're talking about the evidence-based knowledge from well-being science. Okay? Knowledge about what well-being is, what contributes to well-being, how changeable it is. And along with that is a vocabulary. So we have to learn a vocabulary of well-being, which means that we learn that there are different types of well-being. There's different terminology that we use, and they're not all the same. And people even use it in everyday speech. They make distinctions between joy and happiness, for example. And we make distinctions between happiness and meaning. Okay? So well-being literacy is being more aware of these different terms that people use. And that feeds into the second component, which is comprehension. How we understand other people when they talk about happiness, for example. So a high level of well-being literacy is recognizing that 2 people can be talking about happiness, but they may not be talking about the exact same phenomenon. Okay? There's short-term happiness and there's long-term happiness. And those 2 things involve different types of experiences. But people don't make that distinction in everyday speech when they talk about their happiness. So well-being literacy is recognizing that. It also is about how we communicate, write about, and talk about well-being, which is that third component of composition. Okay? So comprehending and also composition. Fourth component of well-being literacy is context awareness or context sensitivity. So this is understanding that the way people talk about their well-being can differ depending on context. How you talk about happiness at home versus how you talk about it in the workplace. Or how we talk about well-being face-to-face versus online. Online, people use all kinds of emojis to express different feelings. What do these emojis mean in the messages that people are sending each other? So context also involves culture as well, realizing that people from different cultures have different ideas about what well-being involves. They may have different preferences for the kind of emotions or feelings that they want to have and the activities that go along with that. So all of this is part of that fourth component of context sensitivity. And then the last component of well-being is, or well-being literacy is intentionality for well-being, which means being able to use that knowledge and use that language to improve the well-being of yourself and others. Okay, there's a little note there about ethical considerations because it's not just about considering our own well-being, it's also considering the well-being of other people. So naturally, ethical considerations have to factor into that. So that was well-being literacy. And what I'm trying to argue today is that part of developing that skill is having a good understanding of well-being science. So what is well-being science? This is the empirical study of well-being. How do we measure it? What are its correlates? What are the things that cause well-being to increase or decrease? And what are its consequences? Happiness is not just an end goal, but there are implications of our well-being for other outcomes in our life. Well-being science is an interdisciplinary field that draws on psychology, economics, medicine, neuroscience, so many social sciences and biological sciences. It truly, because happiness and well-being is such a critical topic, right? It's been approached by researchers and scholars from so many different fields, and we really benefit by familiarizing ourselves and reading widely to understand well-being. And why this is relevant to well-being literacy is because it provides that empirical knowledge base to support the vocabulary and the concepts that we think are important when we're talking about well-being. And when we want to communicate our well-being and our understanding of happiness to other people, it's not meant to be, happiness is just whatever people think it is. No, there can be a science of well-being. It can be studied systematically, and there can be a common language that we use to communicate this to others. That's where well-being science comes in. So as I mentioned, it's an interdisciplinary field. That means that on well-being, and if you are an instructor of well-being, it's actually pretty intimidating to think about how you're going to teach it, because there's so many different fields, so many different approaches, and so many different findings. So a couple of years ago, my colleagues and I scanned the literature on well-being, and we distilled 8 findings that we felt these are solid findings. They're not the sexiest findings, they're not the most controversial findings, but they are the ones that are well supported by empirical data. And they are also the findings that we think are really important for students to learn and for the general public to learn. I'm going to go in detail through some of these, but just to introduce them all. The first one is that happiness is more than happy feelings. Secondly, well-being can be validly measured. Third, income does influence well-being up to a point. Fourth, high-quality relationships are essential for well-being. Fifth, genes and personality influence well-being. Next, people adapt to many circumstances, but it takes time. Seventh, culture and society influence well-being. And last but not least, there are benefits to experiencing well-being. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to emphasize these 5 findings and give us a reason why it's important for students to understand these findings. Okay, so the first key finding is this idea that well-being involves more than happy feelings. So the truth is there's so many different aspects of well-being. When we talk about happiness, there's no one happiness. One of those basic dimensions of our happiness is that sometimes we talk about long-term happiness, and sometimes we're just talking about our short-term happiness, like how we're feeling right now. So this first distinction between traits versus states taps into that difference, right? Within the same person, some aspects of our well-being are fairly stable, and these are usually when we think about how happy we are in general, But when we think about how satisfied we are with our life as a whole, that kind of a judgment is fairly stable from day to day. Okay? People rarely say, I'm very satisfied with my life, and then the next day they say, I'm completely dissatisfied. So those type of stable, long-term well-being judgments we say are trait-like. Right? Traits are supposed to be an aspect of ourselves that is stable over time. On the other hand, we know that from moment to moment, our mood can fluctuate. We can be happy one moment, and we can be unhappy a few minutes later. And so those are states, right? Our states are things that fluctuate from moment to moment. Okay? And both traits and states exist within the same person. So a person's well-being always has some aspect of it that is stable over time, and other aspects that are responsive to the things that are going on around us or happening to us. Right? And if we are talking about changing well-being, changing your well-being state is a lot easier than changing your well-being trait. Right? Changing your well-being trait is going to require a much more intensive change in your habits, your life circumstances, your life conditions. And so that is one reason why that's an important distinction. Okay. Second important distinction is between hedonic well-being and eudaimonic well-being. Hedonic well-being has to do with feeling good or bad, thinking about, are we getting the things that we want in life, so our life satisfaction. So these are components of hedonic well-being. Eudaimonic well-being, on the other hand, has more to do with whether we feel like we are reaching our full potential as individuals. Are we living the best life possible? So when people talk about EWB, they talk about concepts like growth, purpose, meaning, authenticity. And the reason why this distinction is important is because, hedonic well-being is, some people just characterize it as pleasure versus pain. And it is important. It's an important aspect of our well-being, but we don't always choose to do things just because it feels good. Right? We sometimes feel a need to do things to challenge ourselves. And we feel a need to grow as a person. So that's where eudaimonic well-being comes in. Sometimes we do things that are unpleasant, but it's important. Right? We do it because it expresses our values. That's another example of eudaimonic well-being. Okay? Well-being, another important distinction is between affective well-being and cognitive well-being. So affective well-being has to do with our feelings, and I have here PA and NA. PA refers to positive affect, which are happy feelings. NA is negative affect, so feeling sad, angry, worried, for example. So our feelings are one type of well-being judgment. Another type of well-being judgment that we make is life satisfaction. And if you think about the process that goes into that, most people reflect on how their life is going. They reflect on the conditions of their lives, their job, their family, their relationships. So there's a little bit more cognitive processing involved when we make life satisfaction judgments. And so when we talk about cognitive well-being, we tend to think of life satisfaction or life evaluation as something that is more cognitive and distinct from feelings like PA and NA. Okay? Why that is important is because we know from empirical research that different things predict these different components. This comes from a large international survey representative of 95% of the world population. And they asked people to evaluate their life on a scale from 0 to 10. 0 is the worst possible life. 10 is the best possible life. So there are a lot of other questions in the survey, and what they're trying to show here is how much these different things predict life evaluation. Right? So this is a form of cognitive well-being. And you can see that income accounts for 55% of the variation in life evaluation. Rich people feel like they're living pretty good lives, like the best life possible. Very poor people do not say that they're living the best possible life that they can imagine. Okay? On top of income, basic needs are important. That's the 24%. This is having enough food to eat, having clothing, having shelter, things that we tend to take for granted in modernized societies. But remember, this is a survey that's representative of 95% of the world population. So when we go to countries where people are starving or they have to worry about whether bombs are going to be landing in their backyard, they don't feel like they're living a great life. So for life evaluation, these materialistic things matter for their judgments. But when we look at positive emotions, you see that the green part, which is income. When we look at positive emotions, that green part of the pie shrinks. So income plays far less of a role in terms of the happy feelings that we feel in day-to-day life. Instead, what is important are things like social support and respect. Okay, so our social relationships and our social interactions have a big impact on the positive emotions that we experience from day to day. Negative emotions, you see respect is also important. In the case of negative emotions, it's feeling disrespected. If you can imagine having to go to work and your boss doesn't respect you or your colleagues don't respect you, the impact that has on your mood on a day-to-day basis is huge. Basic needs are still important, but also autonomy is important. So feeling a sense of control over our lives, feeling like we're able to do things that we want to do, that we're not just forced doing everything that we have to do in life. Okay, so why is this first topic important? I spend a lot of time on this because this is sort of one of the more fundamental concepts for students to learn about well-being. Because when we talk about improving well-being, the course of action that you might take is going to depend on what aspect of well-being you're talking about, right? Are we talking about PA? Are we talking about life satisfaction? Are we talking about negative affect? So there are different predictors involved, and that's why it's important to have this vocabulary, this rich vocabulary of well-being, to communicate more clearly and effectively when we talk about well-being. Okay, second finding, well-being can be validly measured. In the past, there's a lot of skepticism about self-reported well-being. People thought that if you ask people to rate how happy you are on a scale from 1 to 7, okay, if you just take a few minutes and make that rating, if 1 is completely unhappy and 7 is completely happy, like where would you put yourself? You come up with a number. In the 1990s, what some psychologists would have said is that number that you just came up with is made up. You actually don't know how happy you are. Your judgment is just based on whatever happened to be on your head. Okay, it could be you had a bad sandwich, then you gave yourself a 0 or a 1. Sorry. Well, it turns out that these effects of mood or order effects, the questions that sometimes you ask a participant one question and then you ask them to rate their happiness and you completely change how they feel. Those are order effects. These effects, there are these effects on people's happiness ratings, but they're not as severe as scholars used to think. There's a lot of data now showing that there's a lot of validity in self-reported well-being. When we ask your friends and family how happy you are, there's a correspondence with your own self-report. Okay, so that's one piece of evidence showing that people aren't just making this up. There are other studies, very exciting studies, showing that self-reported well-being correlates with objective outcomes like mortality and immune system functioning. And when we aggregate self-report measures, so let's say you compute the average well-being of everyone in a community or a neighborhood, or in one study, they computed the average well-being of each state in the US. There's 50 states in the US. They computed average self-reported well-being in each of those states. Those aggregate self-reports correlate with objective environmental data. So when you correlate average well-being with crime rates, environmental regulation, access to beaches, average climate, these things correlate with the subjective ratings. So all of this is suggesting that the numbers that you guys came up with when you evaluated your well-being was not completely frivolous or trivial. You didn't just pull it out of thin air. It reflects something about your life, okay? It reflects something about your circumstances. Why is this important? Because students really need to understand that well-being is measurable before they can believe that there can be a science of well-being. And they need to understand that they need to understand that well-being can be studied scientifically and systematically. That it's not just a matter of opinion. Why they need to have that understanding is because, as I mentioned before, there are just so many claims about happiness online in the media, and having an understanding of the science is something that helps them think, like, what is the empirical basis for these claims that you're making, right? They don't ask that question if they don't think that happiness can be measured. So they need to have an appreciation for the measurement of well-being. Okay, third finding has to do with this idea of adaptation. Adaptation is this tendency for changes in well-being to revert back to previous levels. So you buy a new pair of shoes that you really love, and you put it on and you feel so happy, you feel good, you're in a good mood. But after a few weeks, that effect is going to wear off. That's adaptation, right? Things that used to make us happy, over time, they don't have that effect anymore. So in the 1970s, scholars used to think that adaptation was so powerful that people adapted to anything that happened to them. Good things, bad things, eventually everybody returns to a neutral state. So the assumption was, because adaptation is so powerful, there's no point in trying to improve your happiness. Right? Whatever you do, you're just going to go back to your neutral state. This is a classic study conducted by Brickman and colleagues in 1978. They surveyed people who won the lottery, control group of non-lottery winners, and accident victims. So these are people who suffered a severe accident. They may have become paraplegic or quadriplegic. And they asked them to rate their happiness. As you can see, there's no significant difference between the winners and the control group, right? So that led them to the conclusion that, so winning the lottery didn't make people happy, right? The assumption is that they adapted to their winnings. You can see the accident victims are actually less happy than the control group. But you know what they said? They said, well, they're actually happier than you would expect, given the fact that they're accident victims. So even the victims, they said, were adapting to their experience. So the conclusion was that people adapt to everything. There's just no point in trying to improve your well-being. But in 1978, it didn't take much to get published in a scientific journal. You could do fairly well with small sample sizes. They only had 22 winners, 22 controls, and 39 victims. A lot has changed since 1978. There have been more studies, larger studies, and importantly, longitudinal studies that track the same people over time. So this is, I don't have the sample size, but it was, I think there was maybe almost 1,000 lottery winners and an even larger control group in this study by Gardner and Oswald. This was a sample of respondents in the UK. That it's a prospective study. So they just complete these surveys every year, and people report on the things that happen to them. And some people win the lottery and some people don't. And you can see that on this x-axis, we're plotting the year So 2 years before they won the lottery, and then 0 is the exact year that they won. And the exact year that they won the lottery, you don't see any difference between the lotto winners and the control group. And that would give you the impression that winning the lottery has no impact on their, here we're looking at mental strain, so how stressed out and anxious they feel. But it's a longitudinal study, so they follow them 2 years after winning the lottery. Guess what? There's an effect of winning the lottery on how much mental strain they experience. If you have more money, you can use it to pay off your debts. You can use it to pay for medical procedures. You can use it to pay for things that actually have an impact on your well-being. But we don't know that if we don't do the longitudinal research. Lucas looked at a very 15-year longitudinal study of respondents in Germany. And so on the y-axis, he's plotting life satisfaction. And just like in the previous graph, we know their levels of well-being before the event happened. 0 is when the event happened, and then they track their well-being for several years after that. And you can see for unemployment, the year that they lost their job, their life satisfaction declined. 1 year after that, it bounces up, but it doesn't bounce all the way up. Even after 7 years, their life satisfaction is not as high as it used to be before they lost their job. That's not what you predict if you expect adaptation. You expect that line to go all the way back up. For disability, people who suffered severe, terrible accidents, it's even more dramatic, right? So what this finding shows is that we don't adapt to everything that happens to us. And even when there's some adaptation, it doesn't occur very quickly. This comes from the Singapore Life Panel. This is from the Center for Research on Successful Aging. We monitor the well-being of older adults. We have a pretty long time span. So this is mapping life satisfaction over a 5-year period, but we've broken the sample up into people who have high social support and low social support. Okay? These are people between the ages of 50 to 70. And you can see that people with low social support, this is their social support measured in 2018. Okay? Over the next 5 years, their life satisfaction declines. But people who have high levels of social support, their life satisfaction over the next 5 years actually increases. What we didn't do, but what might be a factor, is retirement. Once you retire, you have more time, actually. And if you have lots of friends, life gets even better. If you don't have any friends, life kind of gets worse. Okay, so longitudinal studies suggest that life circumstances can have an impact on our well-being. We don't adapt to everything that happens to us. Why that's important is because what that provides support for is this idea of doing something about your life conditions to improve your well-being. You know, believing adaptation is all-powerful is so self-defeating, right? If you believe that everything returns to neutral, there's no point in trying to improve your condition. Just bank on adaptation working its magic. But no, if there can be long-term meaningful impacts of our circumstances, then it's worthwhile to improve our life conditions and our habits. Okay? And when we talk about intentionality, that is a fundamental idea or motivator to have intentionality for well-being. Okay. Next finding, culture and society influence well-being. Almost every culture, people recognize that there are good feelings and bad feelings, but there's still ways that culture can influence our well-being. So first, the kind of emotions that people want to feel can differ. People everywhere want to feel positive emotions, but there are different kinds of positive emotions, right? Some emotions are what we call high arousal, so high on enthusiasm and excitement. Other emotions are low arousal, so feeling calm, peaceful, relaxed. And what the research suggests is that in the US, people value high arousal positive emotions more than people in Asian cultures. But Asians value low arousal positive emotions more than people in the US. Okay? And one reason for that is that in a lot of Asian cultures, it's important to pay attention to your social environment and your social context and your social roles and just how the people around you are feeling. And if you're too excited and enthusiastic, that you can become sort of like a nuisance, right? You disrupt the social harmony. So staying calm is something that helps you pay attention to the social environment so you can behave accordingly. In the US, which is more individualistic, it's more acceptable to express yourself, right? And to try to influence other people and try to convince people to go along with your preferences. So in that kind of a culture, having high arousal positive emotions and having that energy is more functional. The correlation between positive affect and negative affect could vary across cultures. So usually when we look at the relationship between positive affect and negative affect, we see a negative correlation. People who experience lots of positive emotion tend to experience less negative emotion. People who experience a lot of negative emotion tend to experience less positive emotion. We tend to find this in Western samples. But when we look at samples in Asia, there's a negative correlation, but it's not as strong. So there's sort of it's more common to have a mixture of positive and negative affect in Asian cultural contexts, and there's different explanations for that. One explanation is that it has to do with certain Asian philosophies are what they call dialectical, which means cultivating this belief that good things can come from bad things and bad things can come from good things. There's some research showing that the fear of happiness is higher in some Asian countries. Some people in Asia believe that bad things can happen if you express too much happiness. So these beliefs might influence how people regulate their emotions when they feel happy. That could be one explanation. Another explanation is just social norms and not wanting to feel like you're burdening other people with your emotions. Okay, so why is it important to understand cultural influences on well-being? Well, we said one of those components of well-being literacy is to do with context sensitivity. So culture obviously is one important context that we face, especially in a multicultural society. So understanding the role of culture helps to cultivate that context sensitivity, understanding that people from different cultures may prefer to feel differently, and they may prefer to do different types of activities because of their cultural background and values. Okay, last important finding is that there are benefits to experiencing well-being. Our own well-being can have consequences for our health, work, and relationships. So for example, a study was done showing that happy people are less likely to get sick after being exposed to a cold virus compared with people who don't experience much happiness. Right? So there's a link between positive affect and our immune system functioning. Experiments have shown that when people are in a happy mood, they are more interested in social activities. Right? They are also more interested in pro-social activities. So you compare the yellow bar with the gray bar, people who are in a happy mood versus people who are in a neutral mood. When you look at non-social activities, there's no difference. So it's not that happiness makes people interested in doing anything. There's something specific about being in a good mood and being sociable. And that is just like the first step to forming new relationships and maintaining your relationships. Well-being has a predictive effect on income. So this is this is from 1970. These data are from 1976. So on the x-axis, it's the cheerfulness, the level, how cheerful these college freshmen were back in 1976, and then they followed them 20 years later to see how much money they were making. And you see there's 3 lines there. All the lines are kind of going up, right? That means that more cheerful people made more money. There's 3 lines because the top line is for people who are from wealthy families, and the gray line is from people who are from less wealthy families. So there's an effect of family wealth. If your family is wealthy, you will end up making more money. But above and beyond that, there's still an effect of how cheerful they were as college freshmen. Why is it important to understand that there are benefits to experiencing well-being? Because a lot of students in Singapore, I feel they may not value their own well-being because they don't see it as important, or they may see it as selfish. And so it's important to understand that our own well-being doesn't have to be at odds with success at work or school or in our relationships, right? It can actually make those things better for us. So once they can understand that, then maybe they can start taking their own well-being seriously. Okay, so I'm going to quickly go over 2 courses that I've been involved in that teach well-being concepts. The first is a course that I teach primarily focused on subjective well-being. And I teach it with a specific goal of making sure they have a good understanding of well-being science and strengthening their well-being literacy by introducing the concepts that I've mentioned. And also trying to cultivate an appreciation for how some of these ideas in well-being science apply to their own personal experiences. So we start off by introducing some of those fundamental concepts that I mentioned at the beginning. And we also revisit these concepts when we talk about specific content areas. So, relationships between well-being and health, personality, money, relationships, technology and well-being, such an important topic, culture and society, and well-being at work. So all these concepts that I introduce at the beginning of the semester always get revisited because the findings for any particular content area can depend on how you measure well-being. Right, so we can't escape that point. I also introduced my class to models of how well-being might change. So this is called a positive activity model, and it posits that any positive activity could increase well-being by either increasing our thoughts, feelings, or behavior, or by increasing what's called need satisfaction. So this comes from self-determination theory. The idea is that we have basic psychological needs for competence. We need to feel like we are effective, that there are things that we do well. We have a need for relatedness or social connection. And we have a need for autonomy. We need to feel like we're not forced to do everything in our lives, that there are some things that we can choose to do, we have some sense of control over. And the interesting thing about this model is that it posits that the effect of an activity on our well-being can also depend on other aspects of the activity, like how often we perform the activity, how much variety there is. How effective the activity is can depend on personality or effort. And then this concept of person-activity fit. Some activities just work better for some people than for others. Okay. I have the students do a group project where they choose from a list of over 20 positive psychology interventions. There's a great website called Greater Good Science. They've got a whole bunch of these activities. They have instructions. They're all evidence-based. They have citations for the effectiveness of these interventions. And the goal is for the students to try it out for themselves. And when they are doing it, they are self-reporting their well-being. So we use a website for this. When they're done, they get feedback, and then they have to write a report evaluating this intervention. these are just some examples of the PPIs, the interventions that they could choose from. There's a lot more. 3 good things, that's thinking of 3 good things that happened that day. Doing acts of kindness, thinking about your best possible self in the future. So just imagining a positive future. Using your strengths, so identifying a strength that you have and making plans, like how you will use that strength each day. This is just an example of the results that they might get from the website. They can compare their happiness during the baseline versus their happiness during the intervention. They get correlations. They can look at correlation coefficients because this is a well-being science class, so I want them to have some understanding of just interpreting quantitative information. And a lot of students enjoy this project because they like to apply these concepts to their own experience. Some students do find it challenging because they just feel like they don't have time to incorporate these activities into their daily life. They feel they're so busy with school and work, and this is just one more thing on top of it. In terms of the effectiveness, are the students actually becoming happier? I get mixed results, honestly. Some groups report higher levels of well-being. There are a lot of groups that don't report any effects at all. And I'm fine with that because the goal of this assignment isn't really about trying to become happy. It's not necessarily supposed to be that easy anyway. It's really about thinking critically about the intervention, how it works, why it's not working. And so in their reports, that's what I asked them to do, is evaluate it. How do you think it could have, what do you think made it less effective? How could it be better? And they think about, they bring in some of the concepts that we talk about in the semester, right? They think about how often it was done. Maybe it wasn't done enough. Or they think about the duration. Maybe 1 week is too short, and usually it is too short. And some students think about variety, because variety is something that, the more variety there is in an activity, the less likely we are to be bored with it. Okay? So this kind of thinking is really what I want them to get out of the group project, because I want them to have this critical thinking when they go out and they see all this other stuff online. I want that to be the takeaway from the class. Now there is evidence of some interventions being effective, but usually they are a lot longer. Some of them 8 weeks, some of them 10 weeks. There's an intervention called Enhance that's very comprehensive. Found improvements on positive affect, negative affect, and how they felt subjectively about their health. And so a second course that I was involved with at SMU, I didn't actually teach. My colleagues, Jochen Reb and Eva Peters, led this project. It was a 13-week course called Mindfulness-Based Holistic Education. It was taught at the business school at SMU. And a lot of the protocol was adapted from a protocol called Mindfulness-Based Strategic Awareness Training, which uses mindfulness principles and integrates it with positive psychology to try to improve decision-making and self-regulation. So obviously the text here is quite small, but the idea is we borrow some ideas from mindfulness theory, like non-judgmental awareness, accepting your emotions, observing them. And there are a lot of mindfulness practices that are involved to cultivate that kind of awareness. And from positive psychology, we bring in some of those practices that I mentioned very briefly. But from positive psychology, there's also a focus on, exercising your strengths. There's a focus on positive emotions, not just focusing on the negative, but bringing attention to the positive as well. So both of these 2 areas, we sort of integrate these theories and practices in this mindfulness-based holistic education. And just like any class, there's lectures, there are discussions that happen in class. So those are the in-session activities. There are also some practices that are done in class, like basic mindfulness practices. Between sessions, the students are encouraged to practice every day because the frequency and regularity is really important. There are also quizzes and a group project where they try to develop a project to promote flourishing or well-being in other people. And this course is very different from my well-being science course, which is focused on the science. This class is much more focused on cultivating the skills to improve well-being, not just in yourself, but in other people. And that's the intentionality aspect of well-being science. Okay, so I think I'm just going to speed through this. This was supposed to be the topics that were covered over the 13-week course. These are some of the activities that we use in the class. So you can see gratitude, strengths, positive self-portrait, using their strengths, and the idea that these activities are cultivating self-awareness, self-regulation of emotion and behavior. We did evaluate. Okay, I'm going to skip this. These are just specific ways that the well-being concepts were relevant in the course. So this is a particular model that we introduced in the class. It tries to explain how mindfulness can engender a sense of meaning. So stress tends to narrow your attention, but mindfulness is supposed to free us from our habitual thinking. And by freeing us from our habits of thinking, it broadens our attention so that we can reappraise the situation in a less stressful way. And by reappraising the situation, we generate more positive emotion, and that positive emotion brings with that benefits such as savoring, finding more meaning in our experiences, and ultimately more meaning in life. Okay. So we did do an evaluation of the well-being of the students who took the course. This was over 2 semesters. The control group was students who enrolled in a decision-making class. So there was mindfulness-based holistic education and decision-making course. And in terms of the intervention effects, we found pretty consistent effects on all outcome measures. So well-being measures such as positive affect were higher in the treatment than in the control group, and other aspects, relatedness and autonomy that have to do with our psychological needs, less stress and less negative affect as well. And we did a 5-month follow-up, and we found most of the effects were still significant except for negative affect. Okay, so these are just some preliminary results, but very promising. Okay, so just to wrap up, well-being literacy, as I mentioned, this is a skill that can be taught. Those 5 components can be supported by having a good understanding of well-being science. So having that empirical basis is a really important part of this. The challenge that I think I see is this balance between breadth and depth. So my well-being science course is focused on breadth. I introduced them to a wide range of topics, but I don't get to spend that much time on cultivating the skills to apply it to their daily life. And I think the MBHE course and other courses that are able to spend more time on that are much more successful in raising student well-being. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor William, for such thought-provoking workshop. Your insights into the science of well-being and its practical applications has given us much to reflect on, both as educators and as individuals. May I ask if the audience have questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
Maybe I have 2 questions. What's the relationship between well-being and quality of life? And also in the Singapore Life Review panel, is it Life?
Singapore Life panel?
Yeah. I think it's a longitudinal study on healthy older adults.
Yes.
But is that well-being construct applicable to older adults with cognitive impairment, for example?
Yeah, it's a good question. So quality of life, I think well-being is one component of the quality of life, right? When we expect people to have a good quality of life, you know, their well-being is part of that, like feeling positively about their friends, family, work. So I think quality of life might be a little bit of a broader construct, but I don't view too much difference between those two concepts. And yeah, our sample is normal older adults who don't necessarily have cognitive impairment. Does it make sense to talk about the well-being of people with mild cognitive impairment? I think it does. I think there are even studies showing that people who have certain forms of dementia who are not able to remember or form new memories, for example, they still watch movies and they have like effects on their mood. And you can ask them how they feel, and they will tell you, oh, after they watch a comedy, they will tell you, I feel pretty happy. But if you ask them why, they can't tell you why. So there's still effects on their feelings, even if they can't always articulate the reasons. Yeah. And mild cognitive impairment is a higher level of functioning, actually. Yeah.
Off the top of your head, when working with students, are there certain things that you feel are a bit more prominent in terms of barriers towards this shift of understanding well-being from something more simplistic to something a bit of greater depth? Are there like certain things that you find amongst your students, or perhaps even in your exploration of this scope, like things that perhaps impede on that process of having that deeper exploration or introspection through that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, this intuition that, you know, happy and sad or positive and negative are mutually exclusive is sort of like, it complicates, like, you know, approaches to improving well-being. Because I think that, like, it's actually helpful to understand that they're separable, that when you're in a bad mood, reducing that bad mood doesn't necessarily make you happy, right? So you actually have to do different things to go the other way, right? And the idea that if you are experiencing some negative affect, that somehow means there's something wrong with you. Like those kind of beliefs need to sort of be challenged, because the truth is, like, no normal person goes through a day and doesn't experience any negative affect. So I think these are beliefs that need to kind of be challenged and inspected. And once they are, you know, I think like the students can approach well-being more productively.